So what's happening right now is a very interesting phenomenon. There's an increasing confluence between people who practice Buddhism in one way or another, whatever that turns out to mean. We'll discuss that in the course, and are also academics, cognitive scientists. And we'll talk about what cognitive science is also in this course. Increasingly, this is also becoming more widely known, or at least thought about in the general populace. So I was at a party the other night, and I'm not that good at parties generally. There's like furniture and plants and John at a party. And so people were asking what I do, and I started talking. And then when I mentioned that I do stuff on the connection between Buddhism and cognitive science, everybody was like, "Oh, tell me more." And then I started to say, "Well, I do, work on connections between how the brain is functioning and mindfulness and issues about meaning in life." And then there was a lot of tremendous interest. So very broadly construed, there's a growing interest in the connections between science, cognitive science, and Eastern spirituality, whatever that means, and whether or not the adjective Eastern is even appropriate. Because actually what I'm interested in is the kind of Buddhism that's being integrated into the West, and specifically being integrated with cognitive science. That's the purview of the course. We're taking a look at that particular strand of Western Buddhism that is being integrated in one way or another with cognitive science. But rather than just remarking on that confluence, this course has a specific thesis. The thesis of this course is that there is a reason for this growing confluence. That there's a reason why Buddhism and cognitive science are coming together, resonating more and more with each other, mutually informing and provoking each other. They're transforming each other, and there's a reason for that. The main thesis of the course is that this growing confluence between Buddhism and cognitive science is a response to a pervasive problem that is growing in the West, which is a crisis that I call the meaning crisis. What that is something I'm going to start lecturing on. But the thesis of the course is that this kind of meaning, and I know we're starting with a very vague notion, so be patient, because part of what we'll do is carefully, and I hope in a rigorous manner, articulate what we mean by this use of the word meaning in this course. But what is happening, right, is that Buddhism and cognitive science are coming together to try and address the sources and some of the causes of this meaning crisis. I think this is one of the important tasks facing Western civilization. And increasingly, I think it's a global issue. There is a good book I would recommend to you called The Crisis of Global Modernity, which is written from an Eastern perspective. But the idea that this crisis is now becoming a worldwide crisis through globalization is gaining a lot of traction in academic circles. Some of you may have seen a talk I had with Jordan Peterson on these issues around meaning in life, or a further talk I had with Dan Golderman about how this crisis, the meaning crisis, interlocks with some of the other crises we are facing, like the ecological crisis. And that is also a theme in the book I just mentioned, the interlocking of this meaning crisis with economic and ecological crises that are becoming ever more pervasive. And you can see the interlocking of economic and meaning issues in the recent exit of Britain from the EU. Okay, that was not just economically motivated. Ideas about identity and meaning and belonging were, right, also at issue. So what I want to do first is to try and explain to you what the meaning crisis is. Now, that's going to do two things for us. It'll give us the background for a significant portion of the thesis of the course, that Buddhism and cognitive science are coming together in order to address the meaning crisis. But it will also help get clearer about what exactly we're going to mean by this term meaning. Because obviously we're using it as a metaphor. When we say meaning in life or a meaningful life, we're using a metaphor. We're saying there's something about my life that is analogous to what happens with a sentence or a proposition. A proposition has meaning, it makes a statement, right? You can evaluate it for its content. Sometimes that content could be assessed whether or not it's true or false. Now, lives aren't propositions, even though we sometimes pretend they are to our detriment. Lives aren't sentences. So what is it about our lives, the way we interact cognitively with the world, that can stand as an analog for, right, the meaning that is found in a sentence? That's part of what we want to get at. And there's two ways of getting at that. One way is historically, to try and look at the meaning that has been lost in the meaning crisis. That will give us some insight as to what the meaning is. That's what we will do first. Then secondly, we will do the cognitive science of this meaning-making process. Ever since the cognitive revolution, cognitive psychology and increasingly cognitive science have focused on the meaning-making capacities of human beings. And this is coming to the fore in what is known as third-generational cognitive science. How even living things are fundamentally things that make sense of their world. So we're going to talk about first the historical sense of meaning, then the cognitive scientific sense. When we talk about the cognitive scientific sense, that will also be the opportunity where I will teach you what it is to do cognitive science and how cognitive science is related to, but different from, cognitive psychology, neuroscience, philosophy, linguistics, etc. Once we have all that machinery in place, and it will take us some time to build that machinery carefully and thoughtfully, then we can turn to the issue of the confluence between cognitive science and Buddhism, insofar as that confluence is addressing the meaning crisis. Any questions about that so far? Why we're doing what we're doing? I hope also to make something very clear to you, that the meaning crisis is not just an it's not just an intellectual issue, it's an existential issue. It's personally relevant. A good case can be made for the connections between the meaning crisis and the mental health crisis that is becoming pervasive. There are increasing signs that people are under increasing psychological stress that does not seem to be a factor, right, just of increased reporting or such. One of the things I do, extracurricular here, is I teach courses on Vipassana, a form of mindfulness meditation, and Tai Chi Chuan, precisely because that is my effort to do two things: give people who take courses like this an opportunity to actually engage in the practices. Because Buddhism is like sex or swimming. You have to really do it before you understand it, right? So if you want to get a real understanding of some of the things we're talking about here, you need to, at least in a preliminary fashion, undertake some of the practices. The second reason I do it is precisely because this is a small opportunity. I'm not claiming anything grand for it, but it's an opportunity to give people resources, right, for trying to deal with the mental health crisis that is becoming endemic and epidemic at the University of Toronto. And that has branched out. One of the things the Buddhism, Psychology, and Mental Health Student Union has done in conjunction with the Multi-Faith Center has they've broadened that so that there are now mindfulness practices and study groups and training every day of the week that are available to you. Okay? All right, so I want to talk about the meaning that was lost. Right? And that requires going back to, right, when this particular way of understanding human existence and the meaning therein was created. Because, as we'll see, there is an important historicity, historical dimension to the kind of meaning we're talking about, cultural historical dimension. So the period where I think a lot of people converge on as the period in which this understanding of human existence and its meaning came into prominence was a period known as the Axial Age. This was first pointed out by the German philosopher psychologist Karl Jaspers, and it happens around 800 to 300 BCE, before the Common Era. It's considered to have taken place in at least 4 places, possibly 5. The 4 places are ancient Greece, ancient Israel, ancient India, ancient China. I think you can make a very good case for it also occurring in ancient Persia. We're going to concentrate primarily on the 2 pillars of the West, ancient Greece and ancient Israel, but we will also talk about ancient India, because that is the birthplace of Buddhism. And we will also talk a little bit about ancient China, and one of the books you're going to be reading, Varela's book, talks a lot about Mencius, who was a Chinese thinker from this period. All right, so what is the Axial Age and what's the axis upon which it turns? So what Jaspers noted is that there was a fundamental change in this time in how human beings understood themselves and their place in the world, such that this kind of thing probably seems natural to you. How many of you have read some Plato? Okay. How many of you have read some of the Bible at some point? Okay. How many of you have read any ancient Egyptian texts? Yeah, and notice you're waving your hands quite a bit too. But yes, a little bit. How many of you have read any ancient Babylonian texts? Now, Egypt is a major civilization. The first nation state, it exists for about 5,000 years. Its religion lasts that long, right? It has a huge empire at one time. And yet, there's no call to read any of that literature. It doesn't seem like part of your history. But in a way, that if you stand back and think about it sort of like objectively, you consider Plato and ancient Israel part of our history. They're somehow still relevant to us. Not that I'm saying any of you are necessarily Jewish or Christian or Muslim, or any of you are Platonists, but somehow we consider those people to be currently relevant such that we continue to read them. There's a cultural appropriation of those people from the axial period. Now, it's not just, Eurocentric. How many of you have read any of Confucius, some of the Analects? Anybody? So somebody, see, a bit more. How many of you have read any Buddhist texts? Okay. So, right, how many of you have read some Taoist texts, for example, Tao Te Ching, things like that? Again, all of these things that are considered pivotal pieces of literature from the axial period strike you as relevant in some way, as important to consider, as a source of, and I'm going to put this word in quotations because it's going to be something we're going to discuss and debate in the course, a source of wisdom. Somehow in the axial age, people were producing literature that we consider meaningful, relevant, and in some sense bearing wisdom for how to lead a good life. Other times that precede the axial age do not have that grip on us. We can be interested in them. I'm reading a book every night on the rise and fall of ancient Egypt. It's a fascinating book. Intellectually interested in it. Right? But it doesn't have that same sort of existential grip on me. Now why? What was going on? What was changing? How are we still, and I tried to show you, the children of the axial age. What happened there? What did it give birth to? And how has it been so woven into the way we understand ourselves? So what's happening, right, is a fundamental change in how human beings understand themselves and the world that they're in. There's quite a large literature on this. I'll be making use of some central ideas from Charles Taylor and Robert Bellah and others about the axial age. Mark Taylor has some interesting things to say about it here and there too. But what seems to be going on is a breakup, a transformation in an older worldview, a worldview that plausibly goes back into the Neolithic or perhaps late Paleolithic cultures, especially shamanic cultures. This was a worldview. The pre-axial world is one that's called the continuous cosmos. By Charles Taylor and others. So the continuous cosmos is based on the idea that there's no fundamental difference between the natural world, the human world, and the sacred world. Right? They're not different in kind. They're different in degree. So the difference between, for example, the gods and human beings are not that the gods are fundamentally different kinds of beings. It's just that they're basically superhuman. They have more power. So they typically act. They're not ethical exemplars, for example. They typically act, right, for their own particular concerns, and they're typically also located, tied to a particular place and or function. So, you'll have, Seth is the god of the desert in Egypt. He represents chaos. And that chaos isn't somewhere else. It isn't in another world. It's the chaos that surrounds Egypt. It's the chaos of the desert and the flooding of the Nile. You don't have to go to another world or another dimension to see the reality that Seth represents. Human beings could become gods if they could accrue enough power, enough prestige. So it does not strike anybody, again, using ancient Egypt as an example, it's not some sort of bizarre thought that a man in Egypt is also a god, the pharaoh, precisely because he wields such tremendous power, and that makes him divine. So that world is therefore organized around issues of power. It's organized also in space and time in terms of cycles. So everything is cyclic. The season cycle, the days cycle. Right? Now what that means, right, and we'll come back to this, right, is that you're not trying to radically change things. Because if you change things too much, it will come back to affect you. So what you're trying to do is to become as best embedded into the world as you can. Embedded in such a way that you can find the power in order to find the prosperity that you want. So wisdom, all cultures talk about wisdom. But wisdom is understood primarily as the knowledge that you need in order to get the most power you can, the most power and prosperity you can. So, issues of harmony, right, of embedding, of figuring out how this works so that you can best align yourself with it to get the power you need so that you can best prosper are central. Because this is a continuous cosmos, right, the chaos and the violence that you see in the world are just part of that world. There's no deep difference between the violence in nature and the violence between human beings and the violence between the gods. Yes. This is pre-axial. Yes, Jean-Claude.
Why is it called axial?
Because what's happening is it's an axis, a turning point. It's going from this way of thinking, the continuous cosmos, which is pre-axial, to an alternative way of thinking, which I haven't explained to you yet. Now this is a very powerful way for human beings to be on the world, to be on the earth, to be in the world. It is a way of orienting yourself towards reality that built and sustained civilizations. So I am not trying to cast it as something that is odious or something like that. But, yes?
Can you just explain why have to be embedded in what you risk by not embedding yourself in
So if I change this, that will eventually come back, right, to have effects on me. Now, in the West in particular, we'll talk about China and India later, but in the West, this world came to a cataclysmic end. There's a book that was been put out that actually gives a specific date for it, a little bit tongue-in-cheek. The book is entitled 1176 BC. That's probably a little too precise, but around that time, the world has seen the greatest collapse of civilization in its entire history, much greater than the fall of the Roman Empire, for example. More cities, cultures, and political organizations go out of existence at this time than any other time in the world history. So this is known as the Bronze Age catastrophe, the Bronze Age collapse. There's a lot of discussion about why it occurred. I think it had to do primarily with fundamental changes in warfare that made chariots obsolete, but there's other theories, and that's not what this course is about. What happened was, all of these empires were either destroyed or lost. Egypt loses its empire, Assyria loses its empire, the Hittite empire is wiped out. A huge, powerful empire, wiped out. Canaanite civilization is destroyed. Right? What this did was it shook this worldview. It shook it to its core. What happened was these sort of dinosaur kingdoms passed away, and what happens initially are a lot of small states emerge throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. There's another civilization that collapses, by the way, is the Greek Mycenaean civilization. Throughout the Eastern Mediterranean, right, small states emerge, and there is a lot more experimentation with social and cultural organization. So the analogy I'm using is like when the asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs, these little mammals now have all these niches that they can explore. And there was a lot of diversification and experimentation. And of course, that brought with it new ideas, new ways of thinking. And importantly, what happens during this time, right, there's a dark age in which civilization, a lot of literacy is lost, trade breaks down, there's economic decline. It's a very bad time. But what happens is some things are invented that have a huge impact. What I want to talk about are psychotechnologies. The invention of important psychotechnologies. Okay, so you know what a tool is. You know what technology is. A physical tool is something that is designed by human beings in concert together to, in some sense, fit human physicality. Like the chalk is designed to fit my hand. It wouldn't be good if it was this big. Right? I'm trying to write on the board like this or something like that. The chalk is designed. It has this shape. Right? It has a cylinder for a reason. Right? It's designed to fit my hand and then enhance what my hand can do. My hand can't, of its own, make these kinds of permanent marks. Right? Thomas's water bottle was designed. I mean, imagine if you didn't have that tool and you had to like carry around water in your hand. This is my water for the day. I was watching a show on Homo erectus. It was one of those, reenactment shows. You have to take it with a grain of salt. But I'm watching, and this one Homo erectus is carrying around this tooth that it's found. It's carrying around in its mouth and keeps carrying it around. Why is it carrying around his mouth? I'm like, oh yeah, pockets haven't been invented yet. Okay? This is technology. We're all cyborgs. This is technology. This is technology, right, to help modify our relationship to our physical environment, right? It does social work for us. None of you are dressed like pirates right now. But you could if you wanted to. But you choose not to, because that's a message you really don't want to send. Okay? Now, a psychotechnology is something that is designed to fit the way the mind works and enhance its capacities. It's designed to fit the way the mind works and enhance its capacities. So all of you are making use of a psychotechnology invented at this time. You're all making use of literacy, alphabetic literacy. Pause for a moment. Who are you writing to? You're writing to yourself, which is kind of creepy. Now, what literacy does, right, is it massively expands the cognition you can bring to bear on a problem. First of all, what you can do is you can take your brain at this time, your brain at another time, and yet another time, and have them all work together across time because you've written things down. That's what you're doing. You're writing to your future brain so it can make use of this information. And so everything doesn't have to be carried in your head. It also allows you to slow down and make more permanent your own thinking. You can reflect on your thought. You can stand back and look at it. You can critically examine it. If you didn't have literacy, if you couldn't do that, your thoughts will strike you as much more ephemeral, much less open to your own cognitive access and modification. You can debug your thinking much better if you can write it down. You can link your current brain to future versions of yourself and to other brains through literacy. Try the reverse. Imagine if I took from you literacy. Not language, because spoken language is natural to us. We didn't invent language. We invented literacy. That's why you don't have to go to school to learn like English or French or whatever your native tongue is. You don't have to do that. But you have to go to school to learn literacy. It's a psychotechnology. If I took literacy from you, the problems you could solve, let alone the problems you could pose to yourself, the kinds of reflections and self-awareness and self-transformation you could engage in would collapse massively. Okay? So literacy, alphabetic literacy, is created at this time. It's created by, right, probably people in in the Levant, in ancient Canaan, things like that. It's taken up by the Phoenicians, and then it's taken, right, because they're seafarers, to the Greeks, and then the Greeks improve it yet again. Because the original alphabetic literacy doesn't have any vowels. Okay, so let's be clear about what an alphabetic literacy, compare it to like hieroglyphic or ideograms. So for example, I've had people, it's a very weird experience. I've had people read my arms to me. I think it was at a coffee shop. I don't drink coffee, I was at a coffee shop. And a woman came up to me and she said, "Why does your arm say sit quietly?" And I said, "Well, I thought it said meditation." And she said, "Oh yes, it can mean that too." Okay, so, right, if you have, right, as long as it didn't mean like soup or something stupid like that, right? So, right, if you take a look, for example, at Egyptian hieroglyphs, where you have symbols that stand for like syllabus, or that stand, a syllable I should say, or that stand for an idea, often in conjunction. Right? Literacy is very, very difficult. It takes a very long time. You have to like learn literally thousands of symbols, many kinds of combinations. It's very difficult to learn. So alphabetic literacy makes literacy much easier to learn. This is when your symbols just stand for fundamental phonemes. Makes it much easier to learn. So probably it goes from like about 2% literacy to about 10 to 15% literacy, which doesn't sound like a lot for us because we're used to everybody being virtually literate. But in the ancient world, that's a huge change. Right? Now, the original alphabets are consonants. They only have the beginning and ending consonant sounds for a word, right? So it would be equivalent to, something like this. So you don't know if that's bat or bot or butt. Which means you have to pay a lot of attention. We'll come back to this when we talk about ancient Hebrew. You have to pay a lot of attention to the context in order to determine what the word means. What the Greeks do, right, is they invent vowels. They invent these intermediary sounds, which actually significantly improves the efficiency of alphabetic literacy. So alphabetic literacy is itself a huge improvement, and then the Greeks add the vowels, and that makes it even more efficient. What that means is, right, the power of distributed cognition, linking brains together, the power of reflection, right, the power of communication are all significantly increased. That has a huge impact on your cognition, the kinds of things your cognition is capable of doing. One of the things I want to suggest to you, now it's only a very dim suggestion right now, is you can think of things like Buddhism as very complex systems of psychotechnologies for transforming consciousness and cognition. So this is going to have a huge impact on people's thinking. It's going to make it more powerful and more reflective. And it's going to allow people to, right, criticize each other's thoughts in a more rigorous manner. Now, there's another psychotechnology that's also invented around this time. It's one that you're also very familiar with, and it has weird connections to issues of meaning in life, and this is money. Money is invented at this time. Coinage. Okay, so before this time, you don't have coinage. Yes?
Sir, when you say this time, we're talking about the actual...
Yeah, we're talking here. 800 to,
Before 800.
there's no money.
It's after the Bronze.
Yep. Exactly. So the Bronze Age catastrophe is here, and then this is the onset of the Axial Age. And the Axial Age goes, as I said before, between 800 and 300 BCE. So money is invented because what happens are there's a lot of warfare because there's all these power vacuums. And what happens also is the economy starts to revive around this time because the Assyrian Empire, which is one of the nastiest empires in history, starts to arise. Now, Because there's lots of warfare and there's lots of mobility, people are moving around a lot. Right? You need ways of paying or financing mobile armies. And so money was originally invented for that purpose, to facilitate, right, paying armies that could be very far from home. But of course, it quickly spread to all economic activity. Now, money allows you to do lots of transactions way more efficiently and effectively, which of course is why we've kept it. But money is a psychotechnology because it brings with it a couple of important new ways of thinking. First of all, in order to use money, what does everybody, if everybody's using money, what do they have to be able to do? Yes? Could you speak a little more loudly? Keep accounts, is that what you said? Count, yes, count. Do arithmetic. Right? So it brings with it numeracy. Right? Numeracy, applying numbers to your daily activities, is invented at this time. Thinking of things numerically, having to arithmetically calculate things, right, comes into its own. So people start to use abstract, symbolic, mathematical thought. So what the Greeks do, again, I'm contrasting Greece and Egypt here because we have a lot of access to those histories. Right? The Greeks take something that the Egyptians had been doing for years. The Egyptians had been doing a kind of measuring of the earth. They had measured the earth very carefully in order to try and build pyramids. And they got very good at this engineering aspect. What the Greeks did, though, is they took that measuring of the earth, right, and they made it an abstract mathematical symbol system. You know it as geometry, which is Greek for measuring the earth. But it has nothing to do anymore with measuring the earth. It has to do with abstract, logical, mathematical thought. So people have literacy, they have numeracy, and they have practice in abstract, logical thought becoming more and more pervasive. So of course they're going to start to turn this onto domains other than those in which these psychotechnologies originally arose. So very quickly people start to apply these new ways of thinking more comprehensively. And what's invented, according to Bella and others in the Axial Age, is what's invented in the Axial period, is second order thinking. Which again will seem natural to you. Now, we're going to talk about this later when we do cognition. Every human being, as far as we can tell, is capable of metacognition. Cognition is your knowledge and awareness of your own cognition. So how many of you know that you have a thing called memory? Well, some of you don't. How are you remembering this right now, I wonder? Okay, so you know certain things about your memory. You know that if I asked you to remember, 4 numbers, 4, 7, 7, 1, that'd be easy for you to do. If I would ask you to try and keep in mind 27 random numbers, you'd find that very difficult. Okay, you learned a lot about how your memory works. You understand a lot about your cognition. Everybody has that. You need metacognition for second order thinking, but second order thinking isn't just metacognition. It's metacognition that has appropriated and internalized these psychotechnologies. Yes?
Sorry, what is the definition of metacognition?
Your knowledge and awareness of your own cognition. So, are you thinking right now?
But how is that measured? I don't understand.
How is it measured? It depends on, you would measure, it's a category term, so you would measure it by specific instances or specific processes. So one of the things I can measure, you can do this developmentally. So have you ever noticed that little kids have a very poor meta memory? They think they can remember everything. you have a better, right, understanding of your memory. So I can measure your ability to predict your performance compared to a 4-year-old's, and you will do much better, for example. So you can't measure this per se. You can measure specific processes that are instances of metacognition. So what second-order thinking is, using metacognition to take these new ways of thinking in these psychotechnologies and turn it on your own cognition. So what you're doing in second-order thinking is you're using these new ways of thinking, the literacy, the numeracy, the abstract symbol system, the reflective thought, and what you're doing is you're turning that critically on your own thinking. You're taking a critical metacognitive stance towards your own thinking. And that critical stance is empowered by these new ways of thinking that these psychotechnologies have provided people. So people start to become very, and I don't mean this in a purely negative sense, they become very self-critical. They start to analyze their own thinking, their own cognition, which is to say that in a very real sense, the origin, the beginnings of cognitive science are also in the axial revolution, because that's where, right, the attempt to critically and rationally reflect on cognition begins. Now, what does that mean? What that means is people start to become aware of an important central capacity of cognition. They start to become critically, in the strong sense of that word, critically aware of some of the central features of their own cognition. What they start to become aware of is that human beings are meaning makers, that we make meaning, that we frame the world in particular ways. Now, I don't mean that in just a trivial sense. What I mean is there's a dawning awareness that violence is not a natural part of the world, but it is due to the meanings that things have for us as human beings. A distinction starts to emerge between how things are and how we're making sense of them. What starts to happen, right, is this realization of how self-deceptive we are. Now, there's two sides to this, and that's why when you hear this second-order thinking and critical, you have to think about both, destructive and constructive criticism. So what starts to emerge is the degree to which human beings are capable of self-deception. The degree to which the mind twists itself out of alignment with reality, distorts how things are being seen, misdirects what is important or what we should pay attention to. This becomes very pervasive. But in conjunction with this, because the two are interdefining, right, is also a realization of a capacity for self-transcendence, for seeing through illusion and deception, for having an insight into how you have misframed reality so that you can see things better than you have before. So what starts to happen is this kind of, I'll try and give you an analogy for trying to sort of remember this. Right now my glasses are transparent to me. I'm looking through them, right? And they're in a very real sense sort of framing my experience, right? But sometimes what I can do, right, is I can actually step back and instead of looking through my glasses, I can look at them. I can become aware of the medium rather than just aware through the medium, right? Now, why do I do that? Why would I take my glasses off and look at my glasses? Anybody? Do I do that just because I periodically want to blind myself? Any ideas? Why would I take my glasses off and look at them? Yes? To clean them. Because patterns and properties in the medium might actually be distorting how I'm seeing the world. I can become aware in which the medium of my mind as a lens on the world, is distorting my vision of things. But that could also afford me the capacity for transforming the mind, transforming the medium, so that I could then see the world in a less distorted fashion. I have a capacity, by transforming my mind, to engage in a process of self-transcendence. Now what happens? Yes? I don't think metacognition is generally powerful enough on its own. There seems to be even increasing evidence in current cognitive psychology to become more rational requires learning a lot of psychotechnologies. So to use the analogy that I used with language and literacy, we're naturally intelligent, but we are not naturally rational. Rationality is something that has to be learned. In fact, measures of general intelligence are only weakly predictive of measures of rationality. Or rationality is very broadly construed. Rationality means using the most reliable cognitive methods to achieve your goals. So your goals might be true beliefs, your goals might be skillful actions, things like that. But what you want to do is find the most reliable methods. And your intelligence does not naturally find the most reliable methods. It finds good methods, but it also tends to distort things a lot. So, to use an example that has become associated with me, this is something I study elsewhere in some of the psych courses I teach. This is called the 9-dot problem. Now, if you've been around me for more than 14 seconds, you've seen this problem, because I've become very associated with it. But the task facing you is to connect all 9 dots with 4 straight lines. People initially find this, they think this presents itself to them as an easy problem. Of course, 4 straight lines. No, 1, 2, 3, 4. I missed the center. 1, 2, 3. Okay, wait. 1, 2, 1, 2. Oh. We've had some experiments where we measure how often they moan. Right? So when you do a solution, people get angry at you. They'll say you cheated. You went outside the box, or you went outside the square. And of course, at no point when I gave you the problem did I say box or square. What happened is, you got the lens. Your mind framed this as a square, and what's inside the square is relevant, and what's outside the square is irrelevant. And this is a connect the dot problem. And I know how to connect the dots. I was a kid. You can't change direction outside of a dot. If you do that when you're doing connect the dots, you won't get a picture of a daffodil. You'll get a Jackson Pollock painting. You broke those rules. And what I'm trying to show you with the 9-dot problem is how automatically that happens. What stands out and what's ignored, bam, automatic. So fast and so quick that it's actually very hard to catch any awareness metacognitively of that. By the way, this is where think outside the box comes from. This is the experiments on this. This is where it comes from. Here's what you should know from those experiments. Saying to people, think outside the box, doesn't help them to solve that problem. Okay? Because they have very, very little awareness of what's actually going on in their mind that causes them to fail. So simply knowing that they have to go outside the box doesn't tell them specifically how to do so. Now, the statistical, just so you feel better, by the way, the statistical solution rate for this is not different from 0. It's a very hard problem. Okay? And it's not like how do we reconcile quantum mechanics with relativity? This is because of the human mind's capacity for self-deception. So, what also happens, though, is that you can break out of these misframings. You can break through, Durkheim. You can break through to see things more appropriately. So this second order thinking is to use these psychotechnologies to probe for the processes of self-deception and to try and promote these insightful processes of self-transcendence. What starts to happen is people's vision of themselves and of the world starts to change. What this starts to say is, we bear a tremendous responsibility for our own happiness or our own unhappiness. We are responsible for the meaning we give things, and our actions are based on that meaning. The violence in the world and the suffering are not natural. They're caused by how we think. Dhammapada, the book, one of the central texts of Buddhism begins with, the mind is in the lead. Mind is the framer of all things. There's no greater enemy to you than your own mind. There is no greater friend to you than your own mind. The central insight, which for us has become somewhat natural, this is the core thing that's happening in the axial revolution. And that insight starts to break up that continuous cosmos. What starts to emerge is a new way of understanding reality that can make a place for our role in it. Because now we have a significant way in how we see reality, how we relate to reality, how we engage in our particular actions. So, what happens is the beginning of the idea of two worlds that are different in kind. Not a continuous world that is only different in degree, but two worlds that are different in kind. There is the everyday world. Now this is the world beset by self-deception and the attendant violence and suffering that goes with it. This is this world, the everyday world that is beset, that is distorted by our self-deceptive cognition and consciousness. And those distortions cause us to act against our own self-interest and against our collective best interest. So this is a world, therefore, of violence and suffering, frustration, senses of futility and despair. But there's another world. I'm not saying I agree with this picture. I'm trying to show you what happens in the axial revolution. But there is a world that can be seen free from distortion and self-deception. It is the real world, with a capital R that you should pronounce in a slightly British accent. It's the real world. Right? It's real. It's somehow the world. It's not only real in the sense that it's not beset by self-deception, it's the real world in the sense it's the world in which we could more properly flourish, because it is a world that would be free from suffering and violence, the suffering and violence that we cause ourselves, the self-destructiveness that is endemically paired to self-deception. This world is real not only because it is free from self-deception, it is free from self-destructiveness. It is a world in which, and this is the right word to use, in which we can more properly be realized as human beings. So all of the axial philosophies in religion, in culturally different ways, propose this kind of fracturing. You don't have the continuous cosmos anymore. You now have two worlds that are radically different in kind, because there is a radical difference in kind between illusion and reality. Reality isn't just more illusion. It's something other, radically other than illusion. This becomes a difference in realness rather than a difference in power. project now becomes how to go from one world to the other. How to go from one world to the other. And having a world in which human cognition was aligned with what's real, right, becomes the main purpose of human existence. So what happens is wisdom now changes its meaning. Wisdom goes from the practical knowledge for power and prosperity to a much different kind of knowledge. What wisdom now means, the knowledge of how to achieve liberation, freedom from this world of self-deception and self-destruction, how to transform cognition, consciousness, and character, so that one can live in this real world, a world that is now free from, bless you, illusion and delusion, and free from the suffering and the violence that is caused by such illusion and delusion. So, this notion of we can be trapped by self-deception here, but we can achieve liberation through self-transcendence and be here becomes the central project of the axial age. And what happens, I couldn't hear you. In what? Free will? It's not quite the right way to put it, because free will is understood only sort of in conjunction with a modern notion of determinism and causal determinism. So notions of causation and how things unfold are going to be explored in different ways in different centers within the axial revolution. Now, we're going to talk about something that's happening in ancient Israel that is, I think you could make a plausible argument, is the forerunner, the precursor to the modern notion of free will. And this is the idea of of moral choice that makes a historical difference, that's going to be sort of invented in ancient Israel. So I'll get to that. So, what happens, according to a lot of people, is what Charles Taylor has called the great disembedding. Human beings now fundamentally re-understand themselves. When you have this idea, human beings naturally belong to the world. This is their home. This world. When you have this view, this is not our home. We do not belong here. Again, I'm not saying that this is like some sort of true picture. I'm trying to say what's going on in the axial revolution. We don't belong here. We belong here. That's our true home. And so human existence now becomes a quest for self-transcendence, a quest for enlightenment. What happens is the emergence of all kinds of metaphors that try to capture this change in cognition and consciousness. So what's the metaphor of enlightenment? You're in a world of darkness. You can't see. When you move around, you hurt yourself and you hurt other people. And then you go into a world of light where you can see how things are and you have new freedom of movement and you can move without damaging yourself or hurting other people. This is the metaphor of enlightenment. It's a way of trying to metaphorically capture this change. Another metaphor is the metaphor of waking up. Some of you may know that the Buddha, that's a title, it's not his name. Buddha means the awakened one. So after Siddhartha achieved enlightenment, the term we just talked about, he's walking down the road and he meets, and this is such an axial moment. He meets some people and they're sort of, his countenance is just shining. Right? Are you a god? That's a pre-axial thing to ask somebody. Are you a god? No. Well, are you some sort of divine or heavenly messenger? No. Are you some sort of magician? No. And then they're getting frustrated. Well, are you just an ordinary man? No. He did this. This is kind of how you got to be abusive of it. So, well, what are you? And he said, I am awake. He's not trying to get the power and the position. He's not claiming any of that. He's claiming to have a kind of wisdom. He has woken up. Because when we're asleep, we're in a world of illusion and delusion in which our actions don't really matter or make a difference. And when we wake up, there's a fundamental transformation in our consciousness and our cognition, and we see things as they really are. That's the metaphor that's being used. We wake up. That's also a new idea. But you can only wake up if there's two worlds. An illusionary world you wake up from, and a real world you wake up to. Yes, Alex?
I don't know if I'm jumping ahead or not here, but how would you escape the everyday world while maintaining meaning? Simply because in the real world, there is no meaning. It simply is what it is.
Well, see, that's a cognitive science idea that we're going to explore, and how this sense of this world that is radically impregnated with meaning was lost. And part of the question we can ask ourselves is, well, we've come to agree that this kind of dual world model doesn't work for us anymore. And I'm just speaking for the statistical norm. I don't mean to insult anybody's religious sensibilities here. Right? But by and large, we're moving towards a cultural consensus about the rejection of this, for reasons you allude to and we'll explore in this course. But we don't want to lose the power of these psychotechnologies for self-transformation and self-transcendence. So how can we come to understand them so we can appropriate them? How can we recapture this notion of wisdom so that we can still pursue it and address the issues that face us without having to buy into this? Another way of saying this is what has happened since the scientific revolution is a great re-embedding. We are increasingly seeing ourselves as, again, embedded in the natural world. This is no longer a culturally appropriate way of trying to express self-transcendence and self-transformation. Are there ways of doing that still for us? So that's only a promissory answer, but that's what I can give you for now. So this becomes crucial. There's a third metaphor that is used. Right? And this is the metaphor of being born again or growing up. They're related. They're developmental metaphors. Because, of course, right, again, born again, the idea is you're in one world, right, and then you come into another. Another version of this is as the child is to the adult is to the sage, somebody who has wisdom. So earlier on I was talking about how children, I was talking to you, the children, right, have a much poorer understanding of how their memory works. They'll make all kinds of mistakes that you won't make because you have much better metacognition. You have much better reasoning skills. So here's an illusion, unlike the 9-dot problem, that you probably won't fall prey to, but a 4-year-old will. I know because I've done it on my kids when they were 4. You don't want a cognitive scientist for a father. It's not a good idea. But they didn't have any choice. Okay, so what you do is 4-year-olds are great because they count. They can count, and they know that 5 is more than 4 and less than 6, and things like that. They can count, and they get counting in a basic sense. And what I can do is I can put 5 candies like that, and allow me to conceit that all of these candies are exactly equal in size and color and stuff like that. And then I put 5 candies like this, and you ask the 4-year-old, which row do you want? And what do they reliably say? Any of you? They pick this one. Reliably. They reliably pick it. Now why? Because it takes up more space. Now you know that there are two variables, not just how much space is taken up, but how much of that is non-Canby space. And you know that all of the increase is non-Canby space, and so, right, this doesn't impress you. If it does, talk to me afterwards. I have some land in Florida. Okay, so it has become natural to you to see through this illusion. It doesn't grab you, but it grabs a 4-year-old. They find the bottom row super salient, so attractive that they are led repeatedly to make this. Okay. You see through this illusion. You see through lots of illusions that a child can't see through. But then the idea is the sage, in a similar manner, sees through lots of illusions that we can't see through. The illusions that keep us trapped here so that we can't go here. So wisdom is also a kind of developmental growing up. So you have these different metaphors that are all trying to capture this, they're all pointing towards this transformation. Metaphors of enlightenment, metaphors of waking up, metaphors of growing up. Trying to capture this deep transformation in consciousness and cognition and ultimately in character that we need in order to liberate ourselves. This is the core new idea of the axial revolution. Right? And so many of the world religions that cross national boundaries and become cross-cultural, are born at this time, and they share this idea in some fundamental way. Any questions about this so far? This is the general idea of what's going on in the axial revolution. And an idea of wisdom, and only in a glimmer, because we've still got to flush it out. The idea of what's meaning. What are we talking about when we're talking about meaning? Meaning has something to do with relating to reality in such a way that you're not beset by self-deception and self-destruction, but you're connected to it in such a way that you afford self-transcendence and flourishing. That's part. It's only a beginning. It's a vague beginning, but it's part of what's meant by this term meaning. Wisdom is the capacity for realizing that meaning. Yes?
Of the continuous cosmos and this model, it's not exactly like that. But
Well, it is and it isn't. I mean, what do you mean by hybrid? I mean, so the Tao Te Ching makes a big distinction between the manifestations of things and the way the Tao is itself.
yeah, and also
But that's this distinction.
yeah. But
Right.
he also mentioned something like this sort of idea, like the nature has its own order, like the futile if you just like act again.
There are aspects of the idea of this still being cyclical in some ways in Taoism, if that's what you're talking to.
Yeah.
Right. So but I did say that not every culture is going to represent this in exactly the same way. You're going to have different emphasis. There's a huge difference between acting according to the Tao and acting like in disharmony from it that isn't the same as the continuous cosmos. It has to do with seeing through illusion. The illusions created by the mind, by how you name things and categorize things. How, right? That is the way the mind is framing reality is fundamentally cutting us off from the Tao. But that doesn't mean that every aspect of this is being challenged in every culture. So, for example, the great innovation in ancient Israel is to challenge this conception of time. That's where they're going to place the emphasis. So they're going to see the two worlds largely in temporal terms, an old world and a new world. That's how they're going to emphasize it. So what I'm trying to say is I have to try and present this at a fairly abstract level to catch what they have in common. And then what I want to do is go into each one of them to address your concern and show what was specific and insightful about each one of the axial revolutions. That's my way of trying to show what's shared and what's different between them. Is that okay? All right, so that's exactly what I want to now do. Thank you for that, Simon. That's what's in common, but each one of these revolutions, right, or each one of these instances of the axial revolution, I don't know, is there a difference there between these two? Right, as I just mentioned, is going to put a different emphasis on different aspects of this shared model, and it's going to reject different components of, right, the continuous cosmos. Now what's going to happen in the West, right, initially is we're going to have at least two different versions of the axial revolution, the ancient Greek and the ancient Israelite, right? And they are going to be different, but there's going to be enough commonality between them in terms of this higher, more abstract pattern that an integration is going to occur in the West. So that's going to allow us to further develop this notion of meaning that we're going to talk about that has been lost in the meaning crisis that is besetting the West. Okay, so how did the great disembedding, the idea of wisdom as self-transcendence, and the quest for realness, how did it express itself differently in these different areas? So, again, we have to look at a fairly abstract level. And what I mean by that is I can't go and examine each city-state in Greece and its own particular history. We just don't have time for that. We have to try and get sort of broadly what was shared and in common. So let's start with actually ancient Greece. Let's start with ancient Israel first, and we'll come back to ancient Greece. So this is a very long and difficult thing to understand, and of the three, it's that we're going to examine, the axial revolution in Israel, ancient Greece, and ancient Israel. This is the one that in some ways is the hardest for us to step aside from because it has become so deeply interwoven with the West's self-understanding. So many of us are post-Christian, right? But the Judeo-Christian framework has become so pervasive in the way we have organized our culture, our legal and moral systems, right? Our aesthetic understanding, our understandings of how literature is supposed to function, right? That it is very hard for us to step aside. There's some very interesting books about all of this. So Romer has recently written a very good book called The Invention of God, where he traces very carefully the evolution of this notion of what probably started out as a national sort of storm war god into what we now commonly mean by God. You can read those books. I can't do that in great detail. What I want to try and emphasize is a couple of fundamental changes in Israel due to a particular kind of psychotechnology that was emphasized. And this is sort of a consensus view. What seems to be emphasized in ancient Israel is this new idea of the role of a new kind of understanding of narrative, a new psychotechnology of narrative. And we're going to come back in the course and talk about the cognitive science of narrative. But first, again, to make you realize how deeply you've internalized something. Narrative seems natural to you. You come into a room like this room and you see a story occurring. People ask you about your day and you tell a story. You turn on the TV and you watch a story. You pick up the newspaper and you read a story. Right? Now, try to remember that one of the things the scientific revolution has actually said is there's no story going on. The universe is not a story. But for a very long time, we thought it was. Now, let's go back to the point. It's not just that we naturally express ourselves in stories. This goes to some work done by Daniel Couto and Keith Oatley and a bunch of people on narrative. Right? We practice narrative. we practice it a lot. It's called the narrative practice hypothesis. This is a psychotechnology. We have to practice it so much because it's not initially natural to us. So, the way you can find this out firsthand is to raise a small child. Because you have to go through a stage of your existence where you have to expose them to the process of learning narrative. And this involves a very weird, altered state of consciousness known as watching the Teletubbies. Pinky Winky's going out, going to pick some flowers. Po wants to come. Pinky Winky says, why don't you come with me? Po says, okay. They go together. Along the way, they meet, I don't know. And they forget about the flowers, then they remember. And you go, kill me now. Because it is so grotesquely simplified and boring. And you go, that's it? That's the character development? That's the plot? The retrieval of the flowers? And the big conflict was, shall we go together or apart? That's it. Now the reason we do that is because, think about how complex spoken language is. Linguists are still trying to figure out the grammar. It is very complex and abstract. And yet, you pick it up like that. But we don't, right? We don't do that with narrative. Narrative, we have to really dumb it down and practice it and practice it and show story after. This is why little kids can't tell jokes. Because jokes require narrative. That's also, if you ask a 3-year-old, what did you do today? You get this weird, like, it sounds like the kid is strung out on acid or something. You get this weird pastiche of events that are just disconnected from each other, right? And you go, okay, Daddy loves you, right? That's what you do, right? We practice and practice and practice, and we keep doing it. We tell each other stories. We meet somebody, we want to know their story. You get home at the end of the day, tell me your story. When something happens, and I always find this disconcerting. People, so Orlando. But why? What's the story? And everybody's, and then the story comes out and everybody goes, now I have a story. The disaster hasn't changed at all. All the people are still dead. All those lives are still shattered. But the news ends because we found the story. So we're practicing and practicing and practicing and practicing and practicing. Now, what happens is the Israelites seem to have done something very interesting with this psychotechnology. They seem to have linked it to this project. They come up with the idea of understanding time in a narrative fashion. See, because narratives have a beginning, a middle, and an end in which some central problem is solved. Right? That's a story. Here's the beginning, here's the climax, here's the end, and that's the resolution of the problem that was posed. And so time goes from being this circle to here's the beginning, and then there's some climax, and then there's an end, and the problem was solved. The problem may be that we somehow are alienated from God. The problem is that we're somehow alienated from God. We're alienated from the real world, the world represented by paradise, by Eden. And then there's a story that unfolds as to how that problem is solved, how there's conflict around it, there's resolution, and then the problem is solved, and time comes to an end. So, this view of time is replaced with a narrative view of time. Yes?
Would you say that there's some
Probably.
But it's, in the end, it's resolution and control.
So what Ellen is suggesting is there might be, the narrative might not only point out towards the world, if I can put it this way, but it also might point inward to the sort of some endemic or pervasive patterns in our own cognition. Yes, I think that's plausible. We'll talk about that later when we talk about the cognitive science of narrative.
Sorry, then, so this psychopath of narrative connection is sort of a precursor of like causal chain.
Causal chain, but in a narrative sense. So causal chains aren't causal chains in just the transmission of energy sense. They're causal chains that are linked by how things are
So-
solving a problem.
Okay, so it's like things are happening for a reason, like there's a goal we are aiming at, and
Yes.
it's sort of being solved in a linear fashion.
That's right.
But in the pre-axial world, there isn't a story, it's just status quo. It's the same thing happening over and over and over again.
Right. There are stories.
Things just happen. There's no reason. It just happens.
No. Things happen for this kind of reason, but there isn't an overarching problem that time is unfolding to solve.
Okay, it just happens. Like
That,
it is
yes,
itself.
that's right.
Like it not necessarily has a start, not necessarily have an end.
In fact,
it happens.
It doesn't have a start or an end. Exactly. That's the whole point.
Okay.
It's the eternal recurrence of the same. Given enough time, we will come back to where we were before.
Is one of the points that you're making that pre-axial civilizations, like Egypt, for example, pre-axial, right? They didn't have narratives.
They do have narratives, but they don't have a narrative for time, for all of time, for all of the cosmos. There's a story over here, and a story here, and a story here, but there isn't a story that explains how it all fits together and how time is unfolding the way it is. Let me try and show you a little bit more about what this means. What this means is there's the creation of the open future. Again, I'm not doing the metaphysics here of whether or not there is ultimately an open future. We're talking about a conception here. The open future means, right, that the future can be radically different from the past. Our actions can steer the course of history. And this is where the idea of history, right, having this narrative structure to it, emerges. So what happens in this view is your choices make a difference to how the cosmos unfolds. Now this may be an act of tremendous human arrogance, or you may think it as a revelation of the moral importance of human action. And of course we've been debating that for several centuries. But the point here is what this means, right, is that you understand human action as having tremendous consequence above and beyond your own individual concerns. So the morality of your choices takes on a cosmic dimension. The universe can be steered towards a cosmically good ending or a cosmically evil ending. And your actions make a difference. What comes with this is also an idea of progress. Right? That we can make the future better than the past so that we can move from a world beset by suffering and violence and delusion and self-deception into a world of flourishing, a land of milk and honey, as the Bible puts it. So what starts to emerge is the idea of a universal moral order. And what starts to happen is the notion of God changes. So the God of ancient Israel, he's a weird God. And I'm sorry, I don't mean that disrespectfully. He's different. He's very strange. Okay? So the other gods are like, they're gods of location or function. Here's the God of the left bank of the Nile, or here's the God that manages the rain, or here's the God that manages world. Like they're located, they're bound. Right? This God is a God of history. He moves through time and space. He takes his people, and listen to the language, takes his people that are imprisoned in Egypt, and he liberates them and leads them to a new and promised land. He's not this place, this function. So when he's asked for his name, right, in the Bible he says, I will be what I will be. You can't name me because I represent creativity. I represent the open future. I represent, right, this. It's a radically different kind of understanding. Now it's become natural to us to think this way. This word, right, has become endemic to our self-understanding. Our job is to progress. Things must be progressing. It's all about progress. Again, it's so natural to you because of how successful this revolution in thinking actually was. But that's exactly what it was. So, what happens then is a new orientation. What you've got to do is you've got to develop a sensitivity. You've got to develop a sensibility around the course of history. You've got to be sensitive to how it's moving. You've got to look for its turning points. You've got to be aware of them when they're coming. This is the original meaning of a word that we now translate sort of as faith. But this is, as we'll see, this has come to mean something different now. This usually means believing things without evidence. Okay? It's not what's going on here. Right? Instead, it's more like a sense. It's a sense of timing. It's a sense of how are things turning. What is the course of history? And this word, which we've come to think as meaning significant immorality, which isn't completely wrong, but what at the core of the immorality of the word sin, and we don't use that word anymore. I mean, when's the last time you accused your friends of sinning? Is that a weird thing? You can say that was immoral. You say that sometimes to your friend. You know, that wasn't very kind or something like that. You don't say, oh, that was a horrible sin. You don't do that anymore because it feels like, right? Because there's a lot of baggage associated with it. But this was originally to miss the mark. You're shooting at one target and you miss the mark. How many of you have done some archery? So you know that if you shoot where your eye tells you to shoot, you'll miss the target. Right? You have to sort of do this little thing in your mind where you don't shoot exactly where you see because you'll actually miss the target. So this is the metaphor. What's happening is we're missing the target. We're misseeing things. What we're misseeing is we're not seeing the course of history. The great sin in the Bible of ancient Israel is they didn't see how history was unfolded. And that's why they're eventually conquered by the Assyrians and the Babylonians. Again, I'm not advocating this is true. We're talking about a self-understanding. What you have to do is you have to develop a sense. You have to cultivate a sense and a sensibility so that you can pick up these important turnings. This is the Greek word for it, the kairos. The timing in which things can radically turn or change. And then the idea is this happens on multiple scales. There's radical turns in history, the cosmic history, but there's radical turns in each one of your life. You can experience metanoia, you can experience conversion, right? You can be going in one direction and you are turned to another direction. So what happens here is that the two worlds are given a historical interpretation. They're, right? This is the real world, paradise and paradise at the beginning and end. And in between is a world beset by sin, by self-deception, by missing the mark. And if we can change, we can, right, pick up the sensibility and the sensitivity to participate, to make the choices that will turn things so that we realize paradise again. And what we've done, right, as the scientific worldview has removed our belief that there's a mythological narrative unfolding, is we have tried desperately to somehow keep this going. We have secular versions of this story. We start out with primitive communism, and then we go through all the stages of history until we come back to communism, utopia at the end. We have the manifest destiny. We will conquer the North America, and we will realize the greatest democracy the world has ever seen. We keep trying to find secular alternatives for this. We don't want to give this up because it has become such a profound way in which we understand ourselves in our place in the world. So, this is one of the central moves that has become pervasive. So now we're getting an additional element. Part of what we mean by meaning is something like this, that to have a meaningful life is to have a life that has some kind of good narrative structure that somehow plugs into a more comprehensive unfolding of things. And what we're worried about is that our lives are futile, that our choices make no real difference, that time is not affected by our presence of being here, that we make no difference to the direction of things. And every now and then, right, you can wake up early in the night, 1 or 2 a.m., and wonder. And we pose the questions to ourselves using this narrative language. Where's my life going? What's this all for? I wish I could change, turn things around. So, right, that's part of what meaning means. Because this is one way the West has tried to understand the two worlds. The old world, right, this, and then the new world we're trying to get to, the paradise, the utopia, the culmination of history. Of course, Christianity takes that and makes a particular claim about it. Right? Christianity claims that the pivotal moment is Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, that that's the ultimate turning point. And that if we can see that moment properly, we can sensitize ourselves to the turnings of history. And we can help make the right choices to bring about the paradise world. Now, that was given a particular extra move by Christianity. It was a change, fundamental change, right? That the New Testament claims. Whether or not this was Jesus' own self-understanding, I don't know. Trying to understand Jesus is like trying to understand quantum mechanics or something like that. I don't mean that disrespectfully. It's like we have so many different interpretations. Like, what do you do, right? But you can make a case for how the New Testament interprets Jesus, and that's what went into our history, right? So that's the Jesus I'm talking about. Right? But what seems to be going on is this idea, right, that there is a way of being. There's a way to create a sensibility and a sensitivity in us that will help us to realize this. And this is the idea of agape. We'll come back to this kind of love, right? That becomes the centerpiece of Christianity. So agape is in contrast to two other kinds of love. The problem with English is we have one word, which is really cumbersome. Because you can say in one sentence, I love cookies, and you can say to your significant other, I love you. Cookie, person you've committed your life to. I love you. Okay? So, right? So you're familiar with the Greek term eros. It's where we get the notion of erotic love. Erotic love wasn't just sexual. Erotic love is, so you could have sort of mystical erotic love. Eros is the desire to be one with something. It's kind of a consumatory love, right? So, and I don't mean this in any weird Freudian sense. You can have eros for a cookie. You want the cookie to be one with you. And the way you're one with a cookie is you eat it. And if you think, oh, that's kind of strange, think about the fact that you consummate a marriage. It's the same language. I'm not saying it's good, I'm just saying that's how it works. Okay, then there's philia. It's in the word philosophy. Philia is friendship. So eros is based on kind of a consumptive thing. Not all consumption is bad. Having an erotic desire to be, right, to consume knowledge for Plato was a good thing. Okay? But philia is based on reciprocity. These are two the central notions that are talked about in Plato, for example. And by the way, Plato, if you want to get some really deep insight into love, Plato's a great source, one of the best. But the Christians add this new notion that's there in Greek, but it's background, agape. Now, agape is the kind of love that a parent has for a child, especially a newborn child. Okay. Now, we're talking about ideals. I'm not claiming that all parents are great. I'm very aware of in ways in which I've made mistakes as a parent. And there is no responsibility more crushing than that. But think about it. You bring this protoplasmic slug home from the hospital. It doesn't have any of the features of a person. It can't think, like in any sort of reflective manner. It can't speak. It's not capable of moral action. It can't even hold up its head. Right? And if you love it, it turns into a person. Like, imagine if you could do that with other things. If you loved your couch enough, it would become a Ferrari. Right? It's that, right? This is a creative love. You don't love your child because you're trying to get something from them. That's weird. In fact, we think that's like one of the most evil things an adult can do. And you don't love a child because they're your friend and you form a reciprocal. Yeah, I hang out with my 1-month-old. He does things for me. I do things for him. I keep my promises to him. He keeps his promises to me. No, they don't. They can't even make promises. You love the child precisely because the love creates persons. And in this way, you're like God. You take non-persons and you make them into persons. And it's a historical narrative process. It's an astonishing sort of realization. And the Christians appropriate it and they make it central. It's love, right? And this is how the famous Christian theologian Paul Tillich put it. Agape is the love that creates persons in community of persons. And the Christians take this, and it's a revolutionary move, because what they can say in the Roman Empire is they can take all the non-people of the Roman Empire, the children, the non-Romans, right? The slaves, the barbarians, the sick, the widowed, all the people that are non-persons. The Christians say, we can turn you back into persons. Because the force that does that is agape, and we stand for agape. We follow the way of this guy, the way of agape. John, in the New Testament, says, God is agape. Everyone who lives in agape lives in God. It's a radical psychotechnology. It allows people to radically internalize this idea. What it means to make the choices that create history, create the future, is to love other human beings in an agapic fashion. That's what it means. Now, part of the reason why I'm going on about this is not just to help extend this idea of the psychotechnology of the narrative transformation of history and how it takes a very concrete, specific form as agape. But I'm going to propose to you later that this notion is the closest notion we have in the West for understanding the Buddhist notion of compassion. Compassion isn't mercy. It isn't sympathy. It isn't empathy. It isn't pity. All of those fail to capture what karuna is. I would propose to you that the best term we have, and other people have done this, this isn't just my idea, right, is that agape is the best thing we have from our own history for understanding the Buddhist notion of compassion and why it's so important. Compassion is so important because it is the person-making process. Part of what meaning is to be involved with that in some way. At least that would be the claim. All right. So what we're starting to see, right, is an important narrative aspect of meaning. And I've already alluded to how the rise of the scientific worldview has begun to significantly challenge that narrative way of trying to understand reality and history. And how we have struggled with this already. We have had several centuries. The 20th century is a century bathed in the blood of people trying to keep this alive and real in some sense, and paying a huge price to do so.
Like with money and literacy, is there a historical imperative for?
Yes, there's a historical imperative, which is basically what happens is ancient Israel. This will be fast and overly simplified in some ways, but you have the worship of a particular god associated with a temple, and it becomes more and more like first it's worship of one god as preeminent, and then eventually becomes one god alone, associated with a particular group of people, particular history, and then it gets this universal import, and then it comes to an end because Assyria destroys the northern kingdom, and Babylon destroys the southern kingdom, destroys the temple, and takes all the people away to Babylon. That's what the psalm by the rivers of Babylon was turned into a song in the 80s. That's what that's about. And so what happened is this great catastrophe led to what happened, and a choice was made, right? How are we going to preserve what we are, what we need? What do we need? What do we need? What is our identity? A term that we now use a lot as a code for what does my life need, right? And what happened was a radical re-examination of history and the understanding of this narrative structure as how things unfold. Okay? All right, so what we're starting to see, right, is the beginnings of some of the aspects. And what I'm going to try and point out is, right, this, right, Israelite and Christian idea is, of course, going to intersect in Christianity with what's happening in Greece. In fact, the owner's manual for Western civilization is first part, right, the Bible, second part, Plato. And trying to understand those two together is the task that we're going to undertake. So let's just stop. We won't go forward anymore. We won't progress anymore forward through the course. All right? But let's try and capture and regather what we've taken a look at. We've taken a look at the origins, the historical origins of a concept of meaning and its attendant concept of wisdom that arises in the axial age as right, in the vacuum of the cultural experimentation that were made possible by the collapse of the Bronze Age world. And what happens is psychotechnologies are invented that empower and enrich cognition, and especially its metacognitive aspects, so that second-order thinking is possible. The capacity for self-reflection and self-criticism comes to the fore. And that creates this realization, right, that breaks the old continuous cosmos of the pre-axial world, that there are two worlds available to us. The everyday world of illusion and deception, self-deception and self-destruction, and somehow a real good world, right, that is not beset by self-deception, a world that we can achieve through the wisdom that is captured by metaphors of enlightenment, metaphors of waking up, metaphors of growing up. And then what we saw is this overall move took a particular, right, direction by the addition of an additional psychotechnology in ancient Israel, the application of narrative to the self-understanding of history. And that brought with it new ideas of meaning about, right, changing the course of history, progress, making moral decisions that matter. And then that comes to have a particular vector to it in Christianity, in which the kinds of decisions, the kinds of sensitivity to the course of history you need is agape, the creative kind of love that makes person in communities of persons. So on Wednesday, we'll continue by looking at ancient Greece, and then we'll take a look at how ancient Greece and ancient Israel come together, and then we'll take a look at ancient India so that we can introduce topics of mindfulness, different conceptions, but related two worlds idea that is now coming into contact with the West as Buddhism is interacting with cognitive science to start to give us the means, potentially, of addressing the meaning crisis. Thank you very much.